One of the really key characters in Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik, who's going to turn out to be a lot more important as we get closer to the end of the novel than we might originally suspect, is the 20-year-old, at least at the time of her death, Ella Runciter, who at the beginning of the novel is in Cold Pack and being visited by her much, much older spouse, Glenn Runciter, the chief of Runciter Associates, one of the most important prudence organizations. And as it's going to turn out, she'll play a really pivotal role behind the scenes in what's going on in the novel itself. So we start with her in Half-Life, and Glenn has had her brought out so he can consult Ella about a business matter, and we get a lot of really interesting description here. So upright in her transparent casket, encased in an effluvium of icy mist, Ella Runciter lay with her eyes shut, hands lifted permanently towards her impassive face. It had been 3 years since he'd seen Ella, and of course she'd not changed. She never would now, at least not in the outward physical way. But with each resuscitation into active half-life, into a return of cerebral activity, however short, Ella died somewhat. So let's pause on that for a moment. We've talked about this elsewhere. One of the features of half-life and this cold pack technology is that you can keep a person alive, at least in their brain states, but you only get a limited amount of time, and over the course of these awakenings, these resuscitations, they lose their vitality and eventually move to the final death. So, following through, knowledge of this underwrote his failure to rev her up more often. He rationalized this way it doomed her, that to activate her constituted a sin against her. As to her own stated wishes before her death in an early half-life encounters, this had become handily nebulous in his mind. Anyway, he would know better being 4 times as old as she. So he's 80 years old at this point. What had she wished? To continue to function with him as co-owner of Runciter Associates, something vague on that order. He'd granted this wish. Now, for example, and 6 or 7 times in the past, he did consult her at each crisis of the organization. He was doing so at this moment. So they are going to talk, and he regrets that he can't see her smile, that they can't actually have a face-to-face communication only in this earphone and microphone. And she asks, how much time has passed, and he's going to consult her about these business matters that we won't go into great detail about. But she tells him, I was dreaming. I saw a smoky red light, a horrible light, and I kept moving towards it. I couldn't stop. And Runciter says, yeah, the Bardal Tootle, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, tells about that. You remember reading it. The doctors made you read it when you were dying. The smoky red light is bad, isn't it? Ella said. Yeah, you want to avoid it, he says. Listen, Ella, we've got problems. You feel up to hearing about it. I mean, I don't want to overtax you or anything. Just say if you're too tired or if there's something else you want to hear about or discuss. And she says, it's so weird. I think I've been dreaming all this time since you last talked to me. Is it really 2 years? Do you know, Glenn, what I think? I think that other people who are around me, we seem to be progressively growing together. A lot of my dreams aren't about me at all. Sometimes I'm a man, and sometimes a little boy, sometimes an old fat woman with varicose veins. And I'm in places I've never seen doing things that make no sense. And Runciter says, well, like they say, you're heading for a new womb to be born out of, and that smoky red light, that's a bad womb. You don't want to go that way. That's a humiliating, low sort of womb. You're probably anticipating your next life or whatever it is. And then they turn to talking about the business matters. Where is this telepath gone? What are they going to do about that? And we read something really interesting on the part of Runciter. So he lapses into silence. How would Ella be able to help him figure it out, he asked himself. Stuck here in this casket, frozen out of the world, she only knew what he told her, yet he had always relied on her sagacity, that particular female form of it, a wisdom not based on knowledge or experience, but on something innate. He had not, during the period she had lived, been able to fathom it. He certainly could not do so now that she lay in chilled immobility. Other women he had known since her death, there had been several, had little of it, trace amounts perhaps, intimations of a greater potentiality, which in them never emerged as it had in Ella. So we find out that she's kind of an unusual person, isn't she? And she goes on, they're talking, and then suddenly he's cut off. He can't hear her. Instead, it's this other person, Jory. And he says, get off the line. I was talking to my wife, Ella. Where'd you come from? And he says, I want my wife, Miss Ella Runciter. I paid to talk to her. That's who I want to talk to, not you. And Jory says to him, oh, I know Mrs. Runciter. She talks to me, but it's not the same as somebody like you talking to me, somebody in the world. Mrs. Runciter is here where we are. It doesn't count because she doesn't know any more than we do. And Runciter raises a big stink with Vogelsong, who's running the beloved Brethren Moratorium in Zurich, Switzerland. And they're going to have a discussion. So Jory is like a much stronger signal than she is. They've been sitting next to each other in the moratorium. Maybe that was a bad idea. And Vogelsong suggests that, if you're agreeable to paying a somewhat larger monthly fee, we can place her in a high-grade isolated chamber with walls coated and reinforced with Teflon 26 so as to inhibit any heteropsychic infusion from Jory or anyone else. And Runciter says, isn't it too late? And Vogelsong says, well, she might return once Jory phases out, plus anyone else who might have gotten into her because of her weakened state. She might not like being isolated, Mr. Runciter. We keep the containers, the caskets, as they're called by the lay public, close together for a reason. Wandering through one another's mind gives those in half-life the only, and Runciter says, put her in solitary right now. Better she be isolated than not exist at all. And Vogelsong says, oh, she exists. She merely can't contact you. There's a difference. And Runciter says, that's a metaphysical difference, which means nothing to me. So that's where that ends. We do find a little bit later on, and this may or may not be true. This is in chapter 10, when the team is being one by one picked off. Joe Chip is watching a television program about Glenn Runciter, and we're told that Ella has dictated a decision that he first be put into, revived in cold pack, but it doesn't work. So gave the decision to abandon efforts to awaken belated half-life in the man she'd expected to merge with, a hope disappointed by reality. And then she requires him to be brought to the chapel of the Simple Shepherd mortuary in Des Moines, Iowa, where Runciter is from. Maybe Ella's from there as well. And that's part of the story there. Now, we're not really sure whether that is Ella doing that or not, because as it turns out, Runciter isn't, as far as we know, dead. He's on the outside and everybody else has died. And then after Joe meets Jory, the primary antagonistic force who has been consuming all the other members of the team in Half-Life and many other people, Ella is going to meet up with Joe Chip, not giving her name at first. We read, along the sidewalk, a girl moved in a slow, easy gait. She seemed to be window shopping. A pretty girl with gay blonde pigtails, wearing an unbuttoned sweater over her blouse, a bright red skirt and high-heeled little shoes. Slow the cab, Joe, instructed the driver. There, by that girl with the pigtails. And so he says, "Hi, miss." She regarded him with curiosity. Her warm, intelligent blue eyes widened a little, but they showed no aversion or alarm. Rather, she seemed slightly amused at him, but in a friendly way. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to die," Joe said. "Oh dear," the girl said with concern. "Are you?" And the driver says, "He's not sick. He's been asking after girls. He just wants to pick you up." And so he says, "Let me take you to a restaurant." And he realizes that he's starting to wear down. And he says, "I'm dying, miss." And she says, "Have the driver take you to the hospital." And he says, Can we have dinner together?" And she says, "Is that what you really want to do when you're, whatever it is, sick? Do you want me to go with you to the hospital?" And he says, "Let's go to the Matador." And then she asks him something, and this is kind of interesting. "Care for a lucky strike?" They're toasted, as the slogan goes. The phrase LSMFT won't come into existence until, and then Joe says, "My name is Joe Chip." Now, her saying that the phrase won't come into existence until that time means she's not of that time, doesn't it? And she's going to do something now. She gives him an envelope, and in that envelope is a certificate for a lifetime supply of Ubik, right? And she says, "I'm not a deformation of Jory's. I'm not like him, or these little stores and houses in this dingy street, all these people in their Neolithic cars. Here, Mr. Chip, this is for you. Open it right away. I don't think either of us should have delayed so long." And she says, "You know, there's a list of pharmacies, drugstores, where you can get the Ubik in its spray can version. Let's go there right now." And she instructs the cabbie to take him there. And he's going to ask, "Who are you?" And she says, "I'm Ella Runciter. Ella Hyde Runciter, your employer's wife." And Joe says, "Oh, you're here with us on this side. You're in Cold Pack." And she says, "As you well know, I have been for some time. Fairly soon I'll be reborn into another womb. I think, at least Glenn says so. I keep dreaming about a smoky red light. And that's bad. That's not a morally proper womb to be born into." She laughed a rich, warm laugh. And then Joe has a realization. You're the other one. Jory destroying us, you trying to help us. Behind you, there's no one. Just as there's no one behind Jory, I've reached the last entities involved. And she says, "I don't really like to think of myself as an entity," but that is what she is. Jory is the primary antagonistic force. She is the primary helping force. And then we get an even more interesting revelation. Why is she helping out? So she tells him, "My motivation is not, completely altruistic. There's two reasons why she's helping out. Jory invaded me. He menaced me in the same way he's menaced you. We both know what he does. He told you himself in your hotel room. Sometimes he becomes very powerful. On occasion, he manages to supplant me when I'm active and trying to talk to Glenn. But I seem to be able to cope with him better than most half-lifers, with or without Ubik. Better, for instance, than your group even acting as a collective." So there's the retaliation, I'm not going to let this bastard Jory eat me up motif. But then there's a second reason involved. So she says, "When I'm reborn, Glenn won't be able to consult with me anymore. I have a very selfish, practical reason for assisting you, Mr. Chip. I want you to replace me. I want to have someone who Glenn can ask for advice and assistance, who he can lean on. You will be ideal. You'll be doing in half-life what you did in full life. So in a sense, I'm not motivated by noble sentiments. I saved you from Jory for a good, common sense reason. And God knows I detest Jory." And he says, "Will I be able to survive?" And she says, "Well, you got a lifetime supply of Ubik." And he says, "Maybe I can defeat Jory." And she says, "Destroy him, you mean? He's not invulnerable. Maybe you'll be able to do that." And we also find out that Jory's family knows to some degree what's going on and is paying the moratorium to keep him near other people, to allow him to prey on them. And, we find out that there are Jorys all over the place. So it's not just this particular case. The last thing that we learn about Ella Runciter doesn't come from her directly. She's now off the scene. And this woman, Myra, shows up with Ubik for Joe. He's summoned her into the place. And he asks her, who invented Ubik? And she tells him a number of, as she's going to call it, other Ella Runciter and other responsible half-lifers. So those who are working for the good of other half-lifers. It took her and them working together a long, long time, and there still isn't very much of it available. But it's something that they came up with to resist Jory, and perhaps it could be used for other Jorys and other moratoria as well. We don't really know about that. But Ella is the prime mover, according to Myra, in this. And so she's actually got quite an important role that you wouldn't suspect early on, where she seems just kind of passive, waiting to eventually move on altogether. Turns out that she is one of the greatest, strongest helpers throughout the entire novel.